None of these billionaires are self-made. We as a society make these billionaires possible. As much as they pretend to be of another world and really exempt to the laws of gravity, billionaires are a product of our society. They're a product of our economy. They're made by all of us. A bit through our consumer habits and where we spend our money, but more importantly in the choices we make as a society, as a democracy, about the basic rules governing our economy, the basic rules of the road, the public policies, which determine who pays taxes and who doesn't, which determines who gets to innovate and who doesn't, which determines what we choose to invest in a society and what we don't invest in, and also helps determine ultimately who has power in our democracy to define the future. Billionaire wealth has surged by 70% during the pandemic. $2.1 trillion of wealth was created during the pandemic. And that happened because their companies, the equity, the stock in their companies, for the most part, skyrocketed. Why did that happen? A lot of it was the stimulus checks, allowed people to spend more money, but also the Federal Reserve at a very crucial time decided to backstop the corporate debt market, basically telling the world economy that these companies are going to be fine, they're not going to go under. And that allowed the companies to continue to make profits during the pandemic. There's a lot of myths around the self-made man, and mostly all white men, by the way, given the racial and gender inequities in our economy. But ultimately, none of these billionaires are self-made. Altogether, his empire has benefited from almost $5 billion in government support right around the time of the Great Recession. It's very likely that we would have no Tesla, we would have no SpaceX, and therefore we'd have no billionaire of Elon Musk's stature if it wasn't for critical investments and critical life support to those companies during a difficult economic time. If you look at Jeff Bezos, for example, the wealth creation that came from that monopoly of Amazon came from a number of different public investments, such as a sales tax. And then one last example I think is really important. The COVID vaccines have inked at least 3 new billionaires, 3 of those from Moderna. Just Moderna benefited from $6 billion in taxpayer investments and decades of research of government researchers in public laboratories. And so we wouldn't have a vaccine that works so well without public investments. And Moderna wouldn't have billionaires without public investments. How do some of these companies make such enormous profits? A lot of them do it because they drive wages down and they make working conditions more precarious and collective bargaining next to impossible. Billionaires have now pose a clear and present danger to disrupt our democracy and power over our politics. So it requires a political solution, an economic solution, a tax solution, but also kind of a regulatory solution in preventing companies to get this big and this profitable. Just off the bat, I think we really need to pass the Build Back Better Act immediately. It brings us one step closer to shifting resources in our economy to where they're needed from where they're just not needed and are causing problems. Second, I think we really need to change the ways companies are able to accumulate market power in order to monopolize certain sectors of the economy. And really right-size the companies that are just too big or too integrated and are controlling what we buy, when we buy, how much we buy it for, how much is being paid to workers, etc. That type of monopolies distort markets and they entrench power imbalances. The third, we really need to curb the inordinate amount of power of private interests in our democracy. And then finally, we need a really fair and just tax system. So that starts with making sure that corporations pay the fair share of tax and give back from all that they benefit from society. And also, really importantly, that we break this really vicious cycle of dynastic wealth where economic inequality breeds billionaires who seize the reins of power directly and indirectly, which creates more political inequality. And breaking that cycle of dynastic wealth requires that we really tax the ultra wealthy in new ways and old ways. Including through a wealth tax, with the proceeds of that wealth tax being funneled into investing into the future in a high care and a low carbon economy that we all need and deserve. We as a society make billionaires possible, essentially. And I think that's becoming more clear as some of these billionaires try to separate from the rest of us and pretend that they can live on their own islands and their own yachts and their own planets. It becomes clear that they were born of us and deserve to give back to where, all the investments that we put into them.